Welcome to 20th Century Geek. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and this episode we're going to be reaching into deep antiquity and disturbing those creatures that live beyond the shadows of time and deep into space. Those things that recognise us as just a blip in existence in this bleak and unrelenting universe. We will be discussing those creatures, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, those great elder beings. You may have guessed, actually, we're going to be doing a focus on H.P. Lovecraft, one of the greatest sci-fi horror writers of the 20th century, that does or maybe doesn't get enough attention these days. His influence reaches wide and far. People like Stephen King, Clive Barker, some of the best novelists in the world, and more recently, programs such as Stranger Things have all been influenced by Lovecraft, or referred to as Lovecraftian. But who was H.P. Lovecraft? What was his work? And really, more than anything, should you be reading it? I'm going to hand over now to myself and a good friend of the show and expert on H.P. Lovecraft, Chris Lackey. So please sit back and enjoy the cosmic dread that is our conversation. Chris Lackey, welcome to 20th Century Geek. I appreciate you taking the time out. And before we start, why not introduce yourself and your podcast and other things you do as well?
My name is Chris Lackey, as you already said, so I'm being a bit redundant right off the bat. But I am the co-host of the HP Lovecraft literary podcast at hppodcraft.com, and also the co-host of a relatively new podcast I do with my wife called Rachel Watches Star Trek, where I get my sci-fi novice wife to sit down and watch the original series of Star Trek with me, and we discuss it. And she is hilarious, and I just know a lot about Star Trek.
That sounds like something. That's a challenge. There have often been days when I've said to my wife, "Should we watch this?" and I just get a sort of a blank, sort of glazed expression. Yeah. So maybe one day I think I'll try that with a different show. But there's a hint in there, obviously, of what we're here to talk about today. I contacted you because you have experience talking about one of the most commonly known now authors of the 20th century, H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, well, I mean, you say that he's commonly known, but he is really still quite niche. And I found that out the hard way doing a podcast about H.P. Lovecraft. When I'm out and about in the normal world, I often run into people and they say, "What do you do?" And I say, "Oh, I do a podcast about a science fiction horror writer from the early 20th century." And they say, "Oh, who?" And I say, "H.P. Lovecraft." And they go, "Oh, never heard of him." Almost every single time. Every single time. I'd say once at somebody's wedding, somebody goes, "Oh, I know who that is." Just once.
Okay.
So in our geekosphere, Lovecraft has definitely become a lot more prominent than it used to be. But in mainstream media and pop culture, he's still pretty periphery.
Which is, is tragic in so many ways. I mean, to give an example of things that are so popular today, when you think of things like Stranger Things,
Oh yeah.
and those sorts of shows, there's so many horror films and stuff that people go on. Even things like Stephen King is so heavily influenced.
Yeah.
For them not to know Lovecraft is a real tragedy, really.
Well, it is in a way, but also I don't think most people could deal with Lovecraft's writing because it is very antiquated, and his style of prose is not something that a modern audience is used to. And I think if you're going to get into Lovecraft, you have to be ready to put on your boots and get to work. It's not one of those that you're just going to read while you're on the toilet. It just isn't. That's the style of his work. So I think that Lovecraft is as popular as he should be, and the right people know who he is. And he has inspired so many other authors and writers and filmmakers, because those are the people that do the work, that want to get into it, and they're able to kind of process his work, digest it, and then spit it into the mouth of babies so that they can properly digest his work and get the ideas across. So I think that's okay. So if most people watch Stranger Things, they don't know that it came from Lovecraft. A lot of those ideas or the kind of the weird. That's all right. I think it's fun to have this author whose work is something that it's kind of a club. You have to be a Lovecraft fan. You have to decide, one, that you're going to sit down and read some writing that can be a bit laborious, but if you put in the work, you're going to get great rewards. In my opinion, obviously, that it's about, you only get out what you put into something. And I think with Lovecraft, if you put in the work, you get over his language, or you learn the way that he writes and his meter and the vocabulary. I mean, when I started reading Lovecraft when I was a teenager, I had to look up words pretty much every single paragraph. I remember I read it with a dictionary.
Well,
next to me.
You see that as a teenager. I'm 36. I still do it. So
yeah. Oh yeah. There's still words I look up and I go, wait, what does that mean? I think I know what that means. Squamous. Wait, I know. Yeah. Do I really know what that means? Let me look that up.
I know what you mean though, about what you say about reading his work. It's a commitment.
It is.
But it does pay off. I think I first read Lovecraft about 10 years ago. I was in my mid-20s, and I think I'd heard about it and I took it on thinking it was going to be like pulp horror.
Yeah.
Sort of thinking of that era. I was thinking, okay, it's going to be quite throwaway. It's going to be quite sort of, I get the idea, and then jumped in and thought, well, I'll go straight for the big ones, and so went straight in for the Call of Cthulhu and the Mountains of Madness. And yeah, I wasn't ready. I wasn't mentally prepared to take those on.
Now, Call of Cthulhu, I think, is a pretty good story to begin with, because it kind of gets going right away. The first paragraph is some of the best writing in the history of mankind. I'll just say it. The first paragraph is amazing. But at the Mountains of Madness, the first, 20, 30 pages are about an Arctic expedition and what they pack and what equipment they're using. And it's like, where's the story? Where's the monsters? Where's the cool stuff? Where's the... you really have to go, okay, we're going to sit down. We're going to go through all this stuff. I guess it's important to the story. It's not. It's not important to the story. It's just Lovecraft really loved Arctic expeditions, and he was reading a lot about it, and he was super into it, and he just wanted to write about it. So that's cool. But as a reader, especially if you're a modern reader and you're used to having, reading things that are short, or you're not move at a very quick pace, or everything builds to an end point or is part of the story. You can't. It's like Tolkien. I feel like there's a lot of Tolkien where there's a lot of tangents, a lot of side stories, things that don't necessarily need to be there. Like Tom Bombadil, all that stuff.
Yes,
doesn't really need to be in there. It paints a picture of the world and it's interesting, but after it's done, you're like, wait, why did I read that? Why was that in there?
I know exactly what I mean. I mean, one of the things you learn as you sort of learn through literature are things like Chekhov's gun and that sort of thing.
Right.
And there are rules like that in that, like you say, that Lovecraft is just not going to adhere to.
Nope.
Like you say, there are comments and there are scenes, and you think, oh, that's going to be fascinating when that pays off. It's not going to pay off. It doesn't come back again. Or
no.
But like you say, his style and his the depth of his ideas.
Yeah.
One of the things I did actually, to get into it, I stepped away from the bigger stories, or what I saw as the bigger stories, and sort of I bought a paperback, and it was a collection of some of the smaller stories. And the first one I read was The Tomb.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's one of his first stories. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was so I'm looking through now, because the other one was The Tomb, and then for the name of it. The one where he comes out of the ground, and he finally sees himself in the mirror.
The Outsider. That's it. The Outsider.
Just found it. Yeah, and that
The
one
Outsider.
really. So The Outsider, and that really struck me as well. Like some of the imagery and stuff in that, I thought was fascinating. And it's almost like you've got to learn to walk. Sort of walk before you can run with Lovecraft. Like you have to build up. And listening to yourself and your co-host Chad, sort of when you went through all the Lovecraft stories in sort of chronological order, it's clear that's what he did. Well, he had all these ideas, but he started first. And he was obviously imitating others, and
Sure.
Slowly and surely, like, his ideas come through until all of a sudden you get this sort of like hit after hit after hit of all these this cosmic horror and sort of like real sort of like cutting edge ideas for late 20s and 30s.
Yeah. Well, what I think makes Lovecraft stand apart from other writers and why his work is so enduring is that he, with horror specifically, most horror stories are about a threat to the mundane, a threat to your life, to your family, to your way of life, maybe your culture, any of these things. These are, your world is safe, or was safe, but now there's a threat to it. And the idea with Lovecraft's kind of existential cosmic horror is that actually the default, the base setting of the universe is malignant and malign and horrible. And we've just kind of convinced ourselves that it's not that way, that we've made our own quiet little dark places here that are away from the light of understanding and knowledge. And we live in our little pool of ignorance, and we're quite happy in that. But the universe is actually a terrible, horrible place. And it's kind of twisting the fundamental basics of a horror story. And it's not like the world's a decent place and God's out there protecting everybody, but then there's a few demons that are out lurking. It's no, other way around. In fact, not way past the other way around. We've got this tiny little speck, and everything else is crazy and bizarre and horrible. And that idea is something that really excites me, and I think it excites lots of other authors and filmmakers and creative types.
Yeah, but it is a fascinating idea, because it takes that idea, that notion of safety of, like say our planet and I always find it interesting that when you see horror directors or even authors or sort of certain creators, and they say, oh, the thing that really terrifies me isn't the ghosts and ghouls, it's what other people can do to each other.
Yeah.
And I sort of think, well, no, I see that on the news every day, and I get that we're horrible people. What terrifies me is beyond the atmosphere of this planet, it's an infinite space, and there could be anything out there.
Anything. There could be anything. And I've heard people say that. It's like, yeah, real people are the things that terrify me. But in the reality of our lives, and most people's lives, especially in England and the United States, you're fairly safe. Like most people aren't going to be murdered or killed or robbed. It just, the odds are in your favor that you're going to be just fine and that you're going to live to be a decent age. That's why life expectancy, I mean, that's death and murder is factored into your life expectancy, which is now for men in their early or late 70s, early 80s, and women into their 80s. So you're going to probably live to be about 80 years old, most likely. So that means that our world is pretty safe, generally speaking. especially in places like England and Europe and these types of places where there isn't any war going on at this particular moment. And doesn't seem to be any war brewing right now. But people like to find those instances where something bad does happen, where somebody kills another person and does a horrible thing, or there's a cannibal or mass murderer or shooting or something like that. And they fixate it and they focus on these things. But they are really blips. They're not in the grand scheme of how many billions of people that are going on when a dozen people are murdered by one person. That's nothing. It's not nothing to those people, and to their lives it's very important. But on the grand scale of humanity, it doesn't really factor in. Now, if you look at Lovecraft's world, it's like, okay, everything that you know is just as insignificant as, like, all your cultures, your language, your history, your technology. All of those things will be gone, and nothing will remember them. Nothing will care. It's all very unfeeling and horrible, and that stuff is kind of the true horror. Like, everything is like, you can only die once, so that's not so bad. But I think the idea of your civilization, your people, your language, your species is just gonna fade into obscurity and nothingness is really hard to deal with.
Well, yeah, I think it is. It's 'cause, he looks to the future and the past, and I also find it that, the fact that there was intelligence before us, like this great intelligence, these elder beings or elder gods, and it's like, you are here now, but you are nothing compared to what came before, and you know what? There's a likelihood that they might come back, and you're not going to be able to step in their way. It's like you say, it's the insignificance of the human race. It's it undercuts the arrogance of that we are the dominant species on the planet and stuff. Which I always find that fascinating in his work. Like I say, just that idea that, like you said, that we don't matter, really, in the grand scheme of things. But I mean, let's sort of twist the topic then. Really, I mean,
sure.
This is this person, this man, obviously came up with these ideas, and they weren't typical ideas of the time.
No.
I mean, if you look at the other authors that you've also looked at this time, but I think of from a horror point of view, you do still have the ghost stories and some of the weird fiction. So you get people like M.R. James, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, those sorts of people still writing, and so he comes forward as this sort of sci-fi horror. Where does this come from? Who is H.P. Lovecraft? Who is he, and why is he so different? That's the thing,
it could be from his upbringing, maybe the fact that the way that he grew up, the stuff that he read. I mean, he read all of those things. He also was a big fan of Dunsany and Arthur Machen, and they touch upon the weird and the creepy, but not quite the cosmic horror that Lovecraft was able to kind of encapsulate and sort of made famous, and that's why he's well known. But do you want me to kind of give a brief biography on him, or?
Well, I think it is worth talking about just in general, really, because I think it's interesting. Where he does come from.
Sure, yeah, he was born. H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, was born in Providence in 1890 to his parents, who his dad was a traveling salesman and his mother was just a housewife. His father was institutionalized when he was 3 years old due to syphilis, most likely, and he died a few years after that. So he didn't really know his father very well. His mother, there's a lot of speculation about his mother and his relationship, and that maybe she had some sort of Oedipal complex, which I don't think that quite works that way. I think she was fixated on her son in a very unnatural way, supposedly. But she also was institutionalized when he was about 18 years old and died in a mental institution a few years later. Also, again, probably from syphilis or complications due to syphilis. And he was very sickly as a child. He read lots of mythology. He loved the Arabian Nights when he was a kid. He spent a lot of time on his own. He wasn't very sociable as a child, but he was very bright. He did a lot of writing. There's some of his juvenilia you can still find out there, the stuff that he wrote when he was a kid, which is, it's not very good, but it's the fact that he was writing and doing this was amazing at his age. And he would publish little pamphlets. He wrote about astronomy. He was very into the sciences, but he was bad at math. So he never really got the good grades that he wanted. And he also had kind of a bit of a nervous breakdown when he was a teenager, and he never even graduated high school. So obviously college was kind of out for him, and he wrote for the pulps. His family was of wealthy blood, but by the time it got to him, that wealth was gone, and his family was very poor, and he ended up living with his aunts, his mother's sisters, or his mother's sister. I don't remember. His aunts for a while. He got married briefly, lived in New York with a woman, Sonia Green, but that didn't work out. And then he just moved back to Providence. He didn't actually get divorced. He just kind of left her, and they never filed any paperwork. But he's sort of an odd guy, but he did correspond with a lot of people. His correspondence, his letters that he wrote to people were voluminous, way more than he ever wrote a fiction or poetry or anything like that. There's just, he would write people 30, 40 page letters and talk about all types of different things, either writing or just what was going on in the news or philosophy or about poetry or whatever. I mean, some of his letters are still around, and especially some of the ones that he wrote to other writers. And that's kind of why I think Lovecraft has stood the test of time, is because he didn't really feel like he owned things that he wrote. Like he would share his material with other writers. So if he came up with something in one of his books, like the Necronomicon, if one of the other writers wrote about the Necronomicon in their book, he encouraged that. So there's kind of this shared universe with other writers like Robert E. Howard, who did the Conan stuff, Clark Ashton Smith, just many others. And he kind of also guided younger writers. So Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho and wrote episodes of Star Trek, he was a protege of Lovecraft's. Again, this is all just through correspondence, through letters. He never met most of these people in person. But he did travel, and he liked going out to places. He was one of these kind of guys that would wander at night and go to cemeteries and just kind of like to be in the quiet, in the dark. And I don't know if I would say he was necessarily fixated on death, but just the kind of the quietness of night calmed him and made him feel better about himself, because he did suffer from some kind of.
Thank you for that. That's a fantastic biography. It's a really good overview. I think
no.
It's one of the points you made there is.
Hello.
You see, hello? Yeah, back.
Yeah, sorry.
Like I say, his fixation on death. It's from when you look at his childhood. Obviously losing his dad early, and then the impact of losing his mother later on, and then but obviously he was interested. I think he was obviously a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes, absolutely.
And obviously he comes with that sort of macabre tint as well. But I love the fact, more than anything, one of the things I'm always so impressed with Lovecraft when you look at his work is that thing you said there. It was almost like an open source, horror writer. He would write things that would be, please contribute to it, take it, expand upon it, and do things which I think people still do now. You still get very much the Cthulhu mythos short story collections, and it's funny that one of the things when I first came across him, he was very much depicted as a lone, as you said, a bit of an odd guy. Yeah. But he was never. I didn't realize he was associated with all these other people. Oh, and yeah. The more I've learned is, like you say, he was incredibly generous with his time through correspondence and his experience and his encouragement. It's just, I think it's fascinating to see. I don't think authors today would probably be as willing to share those sort of elements as much as he did, really. No. Well, I mean, to him also, he didn't really see, unfortunately, much value in his work. To him, it was like he got published, in these pulp magazines, and that was about it. And
there was never a collection of his work in his lifetime. That never happened because his work wasn't popular enough. And it wasn't until after he died that August Derleth started Arkham House Publishing and collected his works and started publishing them, and they got more and more popular. And that's when it finally started actually turning a profit and making money. So for Lovecraft, he was just kind of sadly happy that people were interested in what he wrote and was excited that people were sharing in his ideas and his creations.
I suppose it's similar today. It'd be someone writing a self-publishing something through Amazon Kindle and getting some attention and some traction through that. Really, the excitement of having a few, or even creating a podcast and having people listen to it. It's exciting to know that people are trying to interact with you, I suppose.
Yeah.
But you mentioned before about sort of Lord Dunsany and other things, other influences, and H.P. Edgar Allan Poe.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I think that's interesting to touch on is that he did go through periods of writing. Like he didn't sort of land on a. People mention like the Cthulhu mythos, or they say Lovecraftian, but it's not really something he landed on like with day one.
Oh no.
And so he clearly sort of built up to that. So really sort of, what are your thoughts on that then? His build up to that. Where did he go from?
It feels like, looking at his earlier works, like The Tomb and Beyond the Wall of Sleep and the transition of Juan Romero, that stuff seems to be kind of Poe-esque, but then you get things like The Doom That Came to Sarnath and the White Ship. Those things definitely have a Dunsany kind of feel to them. So he was generally trying to find his voice. And I think it was quite a while. I mean, it doesn't emerge, like there isn't a definitive beginning where I go, okay, that's like, boy, that nails Lovecraft, like right there. But because The Temple, that was one of his very early stories, and that was about a German submarine, and then they go and they find this body that has this little idol around its neck, and then it kind of starts driving all the men mad, and finally the submarine goes to the bottom of the ocean, and then there's this city that's glowing in the water, and he just goes off and dies. I mean, that's a great story. To me, that doesn't seem derivative at all. That seems like very original and interesting. It was written in 1920.
I love The Temple. It's really good. I think it's not the story, but the characterization of the German
captain.
As he goes more and more mad and keeps talking about the pure German, and how he gets more and more paranoid about the people around him. It's a really well structured story. I really enjoy that one.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good one to get people started on Lovecraft, because it's short. It's fairly short, and it kind of rolls right into it right away. But like I said, also Call of Cthulhu, I think is his masterpiece. I think that's my favorite H.P. Lovecraft story. There's others that I love as well. Most of them. I like Charles Dexter Ward, and I love the Dunwich Horror. A lot of people don't care much for that one, but I think that's a pretty good page-turning, exciting, sort of more pulpy adventure kind of thing, but still has that great Lovecraftian darkness to it. And there's tons of his stuff that's great.
And I think that's one of the interesting things that we talk about. The Temple. The Temple's quite a straight story. It's you say about sort of the Dunwich Horror but he's also got others he has a dark sense of humour.
Oh yeah.
That I don't think people appreciate or sometimes don't see. I mean, I think Herbert West Reanimator.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Is regardless of the Stuart Gordon version, when you go back to the original story, there are moments in that book that are. They're dark. It's dark humor, but it's still a humor.
It is. And
I think there's a couple of others where it just sort of it drips into the story where you think, oh, he's actually, he is having fun with this, or he's not completely taking this seriously. So it's sort of, which I find it fascinating. Though, like you say, things like the Call of Cthulhu has got bits in it that are that are not outright funny, but there's moments where you say he's got a humour, but the structure there of it being like I think you guys describe it as like a Russian doll, the nest egg story. It sort of builds and builds and builds. It's very well thought through, and it's clearly spent a lot of time, which is I think why it sort of obviously have influenced so many people. But like you say, there are also the ones that you do read and you probably wouldn't recommend.
Oh yeah,
unless you're a completist.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not going to even mention those because they're not even really worth mentioning. So.
No, but I think the other thing as well, as you said, a lot of this was published, or at least became popular, after his death.
Yeah.
And because there was such a desire to publish his work, they were even publishing things that were probably a first draft or incomplete, and which sort of, to some, I suppose, tarnishes his reputation because they're like, well, this one's complete rubbish, and he said, well, actually, it's a first draft that he would probably come back to over and over again. So,
well, that's one of his famous ones like that. That I don't think is necessarily very good, but the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath was something that he wrote and put in a drawer. I don't know if it was ever really meant to see the light of day. However, the Case of Charles Dexter Ward was also something that he wrote and was never published, and he kind of didn't care much for. And I personally think it's one of the best things that he ever wrote. So,
I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that was a sort of an incomplete or never published. I thought that was actually one of the ones he'd pushed forward. I love that story.
Yeah, it's quite popular. A lot of people love it too because it's great. It's a great story.
It really is. I mean, I've read the original, and they did it as a graphic novel, which is fantastic.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know if you've listened to it, but the BBC recently did like a modern interpretation of it.
It's on my to-do list to listen to it. Yes.
I binged it in about a day and a half.
Oh wow.
It's about 8 episodes long, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's listening. If you're a fan of HP Lovecraft, it's on iTunes. It's on the BBC. It's really worth doing. It's done as a sort of it's done in the sort of the structure of like Serial or one of those sort of crime podcasts, and it's very, very good. It's excellent. I really enjoyed it. So I'll be interested to see what you think of it as well, Chris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I definitely want to check it out.
So really, I mean, we've sort of gone through his work and stuff. I mean, before we move on, sort of, just to jump into other bits and pieces, but
sure.
The two things I wanted to pick out about the man is we sort of talked about his correspondence and his openness, and not to cast a shadow over him, but it would be unfair not to talk about the other side of him. That he does, there is a reputation and there is a he had opinions, shall we say?
Oh, he was racist. Is that what you're beating around?
Yeah.
He was very racist. He wasn't kind of racist. He was definitely racist, and that is an ugly side of him. But I think also his racism, in a way, informed some of his writing, and I think it's important that we're aware that he was racist and had these racist attitudes. But not to be a complete apologist about it, he did live in the 1920s and 30s in America, which was an extremely racist place in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, up until, well, one could argue today that America is still quite racist. But in the 1950s, in the 1920s and 30s when he lived, there were still laws, segregation laws. Black people were not allowed to go into many establishments. Because even up north, it wasn't just a southern thing. There were places that you weren't allowed to go because you were black. That's the world that he grew up in. And I think people forget about that. And to put him in his place in history is very important. Now, were there people that were progressive at that time? Definitely. There was lots of people that were champions of civil rights, even in the 1920s and 30s. But as a whole, the structure of American society was about the oppression of African Americans and, well, any person of color really was not treated fairly, not even close, not even in the same ballpark at all or the same street. Like this is way down. It was a bad place. If you go and just look at go online and look at some old newspaper articles from the 20s and 30s about black people or culture And the things that you'll see, I mean, people did blackface and the minstrel shows and all those things. That was fine. That was completely acceptable, and that was okay. And I saw, you can see ads for like black people masks, that people would buy, and they were terrible. They were monstrous, and people thought this was funny. They thought that was okay. It was just poking fun. It was good fun. And I think it's very easy for people nowadays to look back and say, man, that guy was a racist. And it's like, well, yeah, pretty much everybody in America was a racist in the 20s and 30s. It's not right.
No, it's true though. It's and it's got to be accepted that. I know it sounds bad. You've got to put it in context of the time, but I also think you have to put it in context of Lovecraft's mentality. Because although you say he was raised in the earliest part of the 20th century, but he still wanted to live in an even earlier period.
Yeah.
He would have been happily, I think, sort of tootling around in the sort of the late 1700s, early 1800s, if he could.
Yeah, I think he wrote that a bunch. He felt like he was made for an earlier time and an age before. But I think he likes to. I think what is unsaid in that is he also likes to think of himself as a bit of an aristocrat, where he would like to live in that time period if he was wealthy and didn't have to really do any manual labor or hard work. Like if he lived 200 years ago, there's nothing. He would have had to work on a farm or do something, or he probably would have died, to be honest, because he couldn't have survived at that time. So I think he glorified the past in ways that were very unrealistic. But that said, he also was xenophobic, and that's something that is kind of a through line through his stories. Again, his attitudes soften a bit as he ages, and there is some stuff in the Mountains of Madness that makes him look sympathetic at the aliens, seeing the humanity in the aliens, which was surprising for his work, whereas kind of his earlier stuff is about anything other is horrible and is insidious and will destroy things. So I don't know. It's hard to know what's in the mind of somebody, especially somebody that's been dead for 70, 80 years now.
Yeah.
So, where am I going with this? What was I saying?
I know what you're saying. One of the things I find interesting about it as well is, and we'll put a sort of a cap on this sort of area of it,
sure.
Is that sort of idea that, there are some of the stories where he is, I would say almost not aggressively racist, but it's a sort of which I think
Horrid Red Hook is definitely racist, and Medusa's Coil is super racist. It doesn't get any more racist than that. And even The Shadow over Innsmouth, even though it's not overtly racist, it kind of is racist in the fact that the protagonist discovers that he secretly has Deep One blood in him. I'm spoiling the end of that story for you. Maybe I should have said spoilers first, but anyway, I mean, it's a 90-year-old story, so if you haven't read it by now, it's your own fault. But he, that fear of outside and of the other, that is part of his work. That you can see it pop up here and there in some stories more than others, and then that's the connection between that and his cosmicism, his cosmic horror, is kind of at odds with each other. Because if you're worried about some insidious thing getting into your society, your culture, your world, your species, whatever it is, that is a different kind of fear than the idea that the kind of nihilistic fear that, like, none of this matters. Your life doesn't matter. So what if the Deep Ones take over humanity? Who cares? The Deep Ones are going to be dead, in another 1,000 years anyway. Everything's going to be dead. This planet's going to be dead in a few billion years. What difference does it make? None of this matters. So there's that kind of a weird dichotomy in the man and his writing, that sometimes these things are important, but other times they're not important. So just like any human being, he is a complex or was a complex person, and it's difficult to like pin him any one specific ways. And he's also inconsistent with his racism. His wife was Jewish, and he seemed to not have a problem with that, but then at times was anti-Semitic. So I don't know. How do you square that one?
Well, I also understand that he was openly homophobic about certain things, but then corresponded with people that were openly gay. And
well, he wasn't. I might be wrong on this, but his take on homosexuality was more like, I don't get it.
Okay.
More than like, I hate these people. These people are perverts and things, because he took a look at it more historically speaking, and the Greeks and the Romans, they had no problem with same gender sexual relationships. And he was like, those people didn't care. So like, what, I don't get it, but it's not my bag, but whatever. That's just, it's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
That's one of his letters. He wrote that. There might be another letter out there that says something.
You will know a lot more than I. But I do sort of find that, like you say, he was a complex person. He wasn't, a straightforward kind of guy. Because the other thing I find, you see, he read all these things. He was incredibly bright, but never was able to progress it. But one of the things I find most interesting about is in his imagination is, even through all the pulps, and I've read an awful lot of crap from this period of pulp stories, all the way through to the 40s.
Me too.
And when it does talk about sci-fi and aliens and other stuff, they're always Ming the Merciless kind of style. It's sort of like,
sure.
They look like us, but they've got orange hair and green skin or maybe
sure.
tentacles. And it's very sort of based around that sort of humanoid design, even way up into the Star Trek and beyond.
Sure. Oh yeah.
They look humanoid with slightly different bumps on. But for Lovecraft, it was, no, they are completely otherworldly.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that fascinating, that he was almost on a different plane.
Well, yeah, because I think with most science fiction and a lot of those things that you were talking about with the pulps is that the aliens are usually an allegory to something that's going on in our culture or our society. They represent some aspect of us, and that's what it's being discussed in the story. So that's why the aliens seem to be a lot like us and have a lot of our personalities. Where with Lovecraft, his whole point of aliens is that they are alien, that they're so different than us that they don't think like us. They exist in different dimensions than we do. Their sense of time is different than ours. Like, they are something other and something we could never understand because we are so limited in our intelligence. And that was what he was trying to get across, that idea of, again, I'm repeating myself here, but cosmic horror. And with most sci-fi and most pulps, they're usually trying to examine our world, our society, our belief systems, and see who we are. Kind of sci-fi has always been a reflection on current culture, I feel, and maybe where that culture is going to go. Whereas with Lovecraft, he goes, that's not what his work's about. His work is about trying to freak you the hell out and make you go, oh my God, why does any of this matter? This is all horrible. My life is meaningless.
It works.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, that's the thing when you sort of, especially look at some of the older, the sort of the later stories. I do find that sort of that idea of the complete alien. I'm trying to think. It's the I think it's the Shadow Out of Time.
Yeah.
Where the person gets sent through time and space and then finds themselves in an alien body.
Yeah, the mind swaps with an alien. Well, he doesn't. The alien swaps with him, and so he's stuck in an alien body. The story begins with him losing about 7 years of his life. Like, he just has a fit, doesn't remember anything, and then 7 years have gone by, and he's trying to piece together what he did over those 7 years because he doesn't remember any of it. And then, of course, it leads him on this mystery where he finds out, and of course, he gets flashes and dreams of his time, this kind of a bit of a memory of his time in this alien place, but he doesn't know that's what it is. And the revelation of the story is he found out that the Yithians, this great race that existed millions, hundreds of millions of years ago on Earth, they body swap with creatures through time, and that's how they exist in these other bodies. And they explore and they record and write things down, and that's sort of their business. And the bodies that they were in weren't even their original bodies, because they had mind swapped with this race before, and then they just keep moving through time again and again. It's really an interesting story, and again, it totally captures that cosmic horror, because to us that's so important, and to them it's just like, oh, a few 100 million years is really nothing to us. We just kind of jump around wherever in time, and we exist on through the throughout the universe, throughout history. And it's a different type of science fiction, because again, it's not about looking at our culture. It's kind of more horror.
Yeah, and I think that's why it stands out. And I love, like I say, I love that sort of science fiction can do that, can be a commentary of our times through using these different metaphors and analogues for things. But I also love the fact that, say, for Lovecraft, like I say, it was about freaking him out, and he does it. He does a good job of it.
Yeah.
Because the Shadow at Time, when he comes to describe the alien body that he finds himself in, and eventually sort of like trying to use it and stuff, is incredible, because it's not like, oh, I was able to stand and I figured out how to use my legs or whatever. It's, oh no, I've got this tentacle and I've got this and that. And it is incredibly, it's so alien that I think like many Lovecraft protagonists, I think I'd have just fainted. So it is, his take on these things is unique. And I don't know many authors that would still do that today, because they'll say that a lot of people do want to bring it back to the human condition, or to be a representation of things they see in the everyday. I don't know your thoughts. Who do you think still does this kind of thing today? Are there anyone that sort of stands out?
Oh boy, yeah. Now you're sort of going into an area that I don't really know much about. Like, most of my weird fiction reading is set in the early 20th century. I don't read many new authors. Thomas Ligotti is one that people really love a lot, and they say he's got a very kind of Lovecraftian style to his writing. I've never read a Thomas Ligotti story, I'm ashamed to admit. We had Patton Oswalt on the show, and he's a big fan of Michael Shea, who wrote kind of Lovecraftian stuff. But, he passed away. He wrote his stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. So I'm not really aware of who's writing new weird fiction now. I know there's lots of anthologies of people that write. There's people I know that are writers, mostly game writers, that write fiction as well, because I do a lot of role-playing game stuff. And I've written for Chaosium for their role-playing games, and I've also written for Pelgrane Press, which is another UK-based game company. Not much, but a little bit here and there. And it's, if I'm not reading early 20th century weird fiction or science fiction, I'm usually reading either Marvel Comics, which I still read. It's like junk food to me. I've read it since I was like a kid. It was the first things that I read, and I still read it. I'm still interested. I don't know what that says about me. I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but I still read Marvel Comics.
Chris, there's nothing to be ashamed. I'm literally sat here. The latest this month's issue of Wolverine arrived this morning.
Oh, wow.
I'm very excited to read it this evening.
There you go.
They all have their place, and it's all different types. It's all different types of storytelling. So,
for me, kind of weird fiction is sort of my work. So when we do our show, we'll read a story, and then I make notes. I make pretty extensive notes on each show that we do. So I spend on a short story, I spend almost a whole day reading it, rereading it, making notes on it, doing research on the author, doing research on the story, just putting all that stuff together. So when you hunker down and spend that much time on something like that, I kind of like to get away from those types of things. Obviously, I read a lot of role-playing game books, which is kind of a strange thing to do, but I actually read way more role-playing game books than I play them. Like, I just enjoy reading those types of books and that style of writing, and for some reason I get into the mechanics of it. Maybe it's the fiddly bits that I enjoy, and it kind of gets me excited about ideas, and I sort of it's kind of writing in a way that it kind of gets your juices flowing, and that is exciting for me, and that's why I like role-playing game books. But I know a lot of people out there read lots and lots of role-playing game books, but don't necessarily play that much. I mean, that's how I got into Lovecraft, was through role-playing games. I played the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game back when I was about 13 years old, and an older friend of mine who I played D&D with is like, have you tried Call of Cthulhu? And I'm like, what the heck is that? Doesn't even make any sense. What is Cthulhu? And he goes, oh, it's based on this writing of this guy, HP Lovecraft. And I'm like, I've never heard of him. And he's like, oh, you should read this stuff. And then that was how I got into HP Lovecraft. Well, first I played the game and was like, oh, that's really cool. And then from there, I started reading Lovecraft. So if it wasn't for the role-playing game, and I know a lot of people that got introduced to Lovecraft through the role-playing game, and arguably a lot of his pop culture success comes out of role-playing games and the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game.
I definitely agree with that. Whenever I've looked at, when you start researching him and stuff, and obviously the books come up, and there's plenty of, like say, anthologies and collections, but a large percentage of the stuff that comes up is like I say, is related to those role-playing games,
mm-hmm.
and some of the online stuff as well, and then just a plethora of Cthulhu plushies and so it's odd. I do find it interesting that like you say, it's a different medium is sort of not so much taken over, but is become an entry point really for him, and is that the Cthulhu mythos has been expanded. If anything, I think really Lovecraft would probably love it. I think it'd be, if he's willing to share that fiction, I think it's a fantastic new way of using that and exploring that horror. I think I don't know. Yeah, I think it'd be quite interesting to see what people have done with it.
Yeah, there's a lot of material out there. I mean, just of role-playing games alone, there's a lot of material. But then there's lots of other authors that have written Lovecraftian types of works. I mean, even Harlan Ellison, who just recently passed away, he's a big sci-fi writer. He has a bunch of Lovecraftian mythos stories that he did as well, because he came out of that whole like Lovecraft Circle, Robert Bloch, all those guys. Stephen King was influenced by Lovecraft, Clive Barker. There's more Guillermo del Toro, if you want to talk filmmakers. He's a huge Lovecraft fan, and that work has inspired his work. So he's just, to know of Lovecraft and is kind of to be in your own little secret club. And anybody that wants to spend the time and sit and read those stories in their very antiquated style of writing and do the work, you'll be rewarded, I feel. And not just rewarded with the work, but be rewarded with this community of people that exist that love Lovecraft.
I agree. I think that's a fantastic note to sort of to wrap up on. Really, I think.
Okay.
I think he's a fantastic guy. Well, no, it's fantastic. It was a fantastic topic. I do find him intriguing on so many ways. But we'll pop out. It just sort of really, it's sort of like you say, if you focus on the originals, let's say the OG sort of stories. But if you were going to tell someone, here's a story for you to get to as an entry point, and here's the story that you really need to sort of spend some time with, what are the two stories that you would recommend?
Well, again, the Call of Cthulhu, number one. I say that's the pure pudding. That's the goodness. It gives you everything. It starts off fast. It moves at a good clip. It's got freaking Cthulhu in it, for crying out loud. It delivers. But if you want other things, I would say The Hound is a pretty cool story. Like I said, The Temple is pretty great. Rats in the Walls, very creepy, cool story as well. What other ones? I said the Dunwich Horror. I would not recommend At the Mountains of Madness, just because you've got to slog through all of that Arctic Expedition stuff. However, I would give somebody Ian J. Colbard's adaptation, his graphic novel adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness, and say, read that. Because I think, honestly, that is a great way to introduce somebody into Lovecraft. And if they like that, then they could go back and read the whole story themselves.
Is he the person that also did the case of Charles Dexter Ward?
Yes.
Graphic novel.
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Charles Dexter Ward. He also did 4 of them. He did Shadows Out of Time, and he did an adaptation also of the King in Yellow stuff, the Robert Chambers.
Oh, wow.
Which it was very good as well. Yeah, and he's my friend, so I can't recommend his stuff enough. He Chad and I co-wrote a graphic novel with him called Deadbeats that came out about 2012, I think. That sounds about right. Maybe 2013. And it's set in the 1920s. It's about jazz musicians on the run from the mob. Go to a small town where there is a Cthulhu cult kind of thing and zombies and stuff. And it's kind of a comedy, kind of action, sort of Lovecraftian. Lots of fun. I'm very proud of it. It never really had the sales that we hoped it was going to have, but I still go back and pick it up every once in a while and go, that's a good book. So if you can find it out there, good luck, because I think it's out of print now. It's called Deadbeats, and it's from Self-Made Hero publisher. Okay.
Excellent. If you can find it, it'll probably be on Amazon or eBay or something. But I'll definitely try that out.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that the Charles Dexter Ward graphic novel, and I do want to try some of the others, so I will be tracking those.
Oh yeah, I would say his At the Mountains of Madness is amazing. It's almost, I almost want to say it's better than the original story. Yeah.
I think like you say, I think reading his work can be difficult, but it's rewarding. But I definitely agree that At the Mountains of Madness is it's something you work up to. You know, it's yeah. But I say a comic version or a graphic novel version would be more appealing, I think, especially because his art. I love the guy's art. I do think to sort of have that pictorial representation would make it a lot more accessible.
All right.
And also you can compact things and remove some of the gumph that doesn't need to be there.
I on Deadbeats, I just looked it up. It is on Amazon in the UK and actually on the Kindle. So if you want a Kindle version, a digital version of it, you can get it there. So it is available.
There you go. Track that down.
Deadbeats by Lackey, Pfeiffer, and Coldbard.
Excellent. So I could go on because I'm looking at my notes, and there's so much things that sort of.
There's a lot.
But I don't know what you use your time, because I do think about all the influences, and especially sort of from my point of view, as you said about the entry points. You mentioned Clive Barker. That was actually my sort of working backwards. That was my entry point to Lovecraft.
Oh wow! Yeah.
That and The Thing. So there are so many sort of people influenced. I think one of the things I'm going to do later in the year is John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy, The Thing, Prince of Darkness, and In the Mouth of Madness, and all three of those are clearly very Lovecraftian in influence. So I'm really forward to those sorts of films.
Yeah.
But Chris, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you sort of catching up and talking about.
No problem.
Howard Phillips Lovecraft. And one last time, give the podcast and anything else a pop.
Go check us out at hppodcraft.com or go onto Patreon and look for the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast or Witch House Media. That's kind of the company that we run under. Witch House Media is also another website that you can go to and check that out. That's got some of our writing and other things on there as well. And if you want to hear me talk about Star Trek, which I know a lot about that as well, please check out my very accessible podcast about Star Trek called Rachel Watches Star Trek, where my wife, who is not a sci-fi person, watches Star Trek and we talk about it. So it's one of those things where I think it's anybody could listen to it. If you've never watched Star Trek, it's a perfect thing to listen to. And that is all. I have nothing else to plug. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's been brilliant.
Uh-huh.
Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. A fantastic conversation with the great Chris Lackey. I really appreciate him coming on the show to talk about HP Lovecraft. And please do check out the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast. I've worked my way through an awful lot of their episodes, and their analysis and discussion on Lovecraft's work and Lovecraftian work and other tales of the weird and horror is fantastic. It's humorous, it's entertaining, and it's also thought-provoking and educational. So I really highly recommend that show if you like this topic. And also, Rachel watches Star Trek. I have also listened to a couple of episodes of that, and I do recommend that as well. It really made me laugh. If you have ever watched the original series of Star Trek, it's really worth having a listen just to see how an outsider views some of the tropes and cliches of the original series. So go and check those out. I should also say that this podcast was opened with a paragraph, the first paragraph of the story, The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. And as Chris said in the discussion, possibly one of the best pieces of writing, not just of Lovecraft, but of all horror weird fiction. So this is why I think people should check this out. There's a lot of Lovecraft on Kindle at a very low price, or you can pick up some fantastic paperback or hardback collections of his work. Please seek it out and give it a try, and then let me know what you think. I'd love to know. So if you want to get in contact, all the usual ways, by email, 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com, on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, 20th Century Geek Podcast. We are there. Please look us up. Come say hello. Happy to talk to anybody about any of the topics you want to talk about. And of course, we have got our Patreon account, so please go over there, check it out. And if you want to throw a couple of coppers our way, all of it is greatly appreciated. And finally, the YouTube channel. Go and check it out. It's still a very early doors. They're not great yet, but we're working on them. We're going to have some fantastic content on there. So, I shall wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again soon.